Okay, well, I think we should be getting started. Probably we have already a significant number of participants. So the session will be recorded, and let me just share my screen. Thank you all for being here. We are delighted to have you and have this session with us. Um, the intention today is to look at how the connection between executive compensation and climate transition. And we are hosted by ecoDa, the European Confederation of Directors Association. So thank you, ecoDa, for allowing us to partner with you in this very interesting opportunity. We are going today to go through a 10 to 15 minutes presentation on how this guidebook, what is the content of this guidebook, and then we are going to have a panel discussion with Shai, Michael, and Natasha. I will hand over to them for a presentation later during today. I am responsible for, I'm a senior director in Willis Towers Watson in executive compensation and board advisory in continental Europe. And just remember, please drop in your question at the bottom of the screen, so we will address the questions at the end of the session today, which will be just 10 minutes before kind of the hour. Let me see that everything works. Are you seeing my screen moving? Yeah, okay. The panel will be by Shai moderating the panel, and Michael and Natasha. I already said that, so let's just move forward. The first thing we are going to cover today is the landscape that we are seeing in executive compensation. I mean, in climate transition, because this is very relevant to the executive compensation guidebook for climate transition that we developed together with the World Economic Forum. There is a clear demand for from all organizations to make management accountable for the delivery of a transition strategy. And this is not easy task. It comes with risk and opportunities that we need to tackle. And one of the final things, and this is the topic today, is how we bring relevant KPIs into the executive compensation framework for executives in organizations, so that this all aligns. The guidebook we have developed based on our experience through working with management, with boards, with supervisors, with regulators. So let's have a look at the context, at the business context that we have today and the regulatory context that we have today. Well, I think everybody will agree that everyone is concerned about that. I'm not going to enter into the discussion on whether everybody agrees, but I think it is a fact that it is out there and it's very relevant. The key point that I would highlight in terms of the business context is probably the customers and employees, because what we are seeing is that customers will make informed decisions around who they buy their products from, and this will be an element that they will take into account. And employees and talent, in this moment in which we are concerned about attraction and retention of talent, this big scarcity and big attrition, employees are also going to make informed decisions about that. So that is going to be important. Investors wise, we are going to be talking later probably a little bit deeper on that. They are there, whether it is proxy advisors or institutional investors. And the last thing they are, pushing much in the last year, I would say, is, hey, we want to see these in the incentives. And that's what we are going to be talking today. Regulatory wise, probably the European Union might be spearheading this to an extent, but, US is also very aligned to that, very much pushing for that. And very recently, just a couple of weeks ago, we have this proposal for directive in the European Union on corporate sustainable due diligence, which, I just highlighted a couple of things there where, companies should really adopt a plan for companies to be sustainable, include emission reduction objectives, and, include it in the variable remuneration, precisely what we are talking today. Let's have a look at the market. So we run a research on more than 500 companies to see to which extent this is already happening. And well, it's happening, but still a long way ahead. What we see is that a majority, a significant number of companies in the range of 20–30% are already including in Europe, are already including KPIs in their top executive management, top executive remuneration frameworks. In the US, it's a little bit lower. And what you will also see is that it is more prevalent in short-term incentives than in long-term. And many often people ask me, why is that? Isn't it sustainable investment, something which is long or very, very long-term? So yeah, the problem is that we don't know how to do it well. And when you are insecure about what are the implications of that or how you can actually forecast or put a budget on something, you just start with something which is more controllable. And short-term incentive is more controllable than long-term, and short-term is easy to correct on a yearly basis than long-term. So that's why we see still a prevalence on the short-term incentive plans. But the trend is growing toward long-term, while companies get confidence in how to forecast for reasonable budget, where they feel confidence about the right KPIs, all of that. So actually, 80% of companies that we address in this study were planning to visit or revisit this within 2022 or 2023, which 80% is almost everybody. So well, that's just as a business context and regulatory context what I wanted to share. Let's have a look at the guidebook itself that we developed. So we see this as a process, aligning climate priorities with business strategy, and our climate goals should be tied to net zero vision. I think this is easy to say, but it's not by any means easy to do. Moving from the typical complying with an index that we've seen perhaps before the pandemic or in the first year to develop the way we produce our products, our processes to be climate efficient is not really easy task. Understanding the scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 measures, particularly the scope 3 ones, are really challenging. Remember, the scope 1 measures are the one directly that you can directly control. Scope 2 you can control is like, if the electricity you buy, the power you buy is green or not, that would be scope 2. Scope 3 is everything else in your production chain. Like us as a consultant, are we green when we consult with the client? That's the scope 3 for this client. So that's that's really challenging. So building and thinking about that and building the bridge between the strategy with the net zero vision. I mean, creating the net zero vision and connecting it with the business strategy is very important and is very difficult. So that's something we need to work, and it's okay to have to reshape it, refine it over time. The other couple of key points that I will mention here is select the right metrics and select the right type of incentive. I'm going to focus in the next couple of slides about that, so I'm going to pass them for a moment. But obviously we have to use the right tools. So I want to focus in this slide in tell the right story. This is very important. How you connect your strategy with your net zero vision and how the metrics that you select connect to that is part of the story, a very important part of the story you want to tell. And we are in the era of telling stories. So that is, I cannot, I would like to share how important I think this is, telling the right story to the different stakeholders. It's not only to shareholders, it's to all different stakeholders. And of course, as I have said, that's, it doesn't need to be perfect in the first iteration. We have to be humble and recognize that this is new, this is complex, and we need to refine and reiterate year over year until we get to a point that everything feels sufficiently sound to keep it stable. How can we select the right metrics? Well, I think the first thing is we have to have an appropriate governance. I mean, I was mentioning before about the scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 type of things. So the governance about what are the climate topics that we should be prioritizing, who or where they should be addressed. It is the committees, the full board, how often addressing them. Is a by yearly thing, or is it yearly, or is it quarterly? And how we help the boards to provide effective oversight on that. That's something that we have to think as well. Um, our recommendation would be just think about, for what is the focus for the board is what are the areas that pose most opportunities and most risks. Pretty obvious, but again, that's not easy to find out either. How can we manage this? Because these myriad of things that we have are too many just to keep the board informed, prioritize. But of course, the board has to have sufficient information and ability to actually reprioritize. So they need to know, okay, fine, that's the whole spectrum. We can tackle everything, but we are fine to cover these things. So we also have to create a governance that help us, the board, knowing everything that is there, and then agreeing to what has been prioritized. Again, disclosure, at the end of the day, a portion of all of that is going to be told to stakeholders. So, again, we need the board to be knowledgeable of that and owning this process of communication, because it is very important. We are under scrutiny. So what is going to be disclosed, when, where, that is all relevant to the storytelling that I was mentioning before. And finally, we get to, and a portion of all of that is in incentives. So we don't necessarily put everything into top executive incentive. We just put whatever it makes sense. It doesn't have to be everything. So, ideally, and I'll talk in a moment about that a little bit more, let's choose metrics that can be measured, tested, that will work. And yes, I know it's not easy. Again, sorry to be repeating myself a lot, but just want to give clarity that this is not easy task. And of course, all of the metrics that you disclose, everything that you do for top executives is going to be in the public domain too. So it has to be aligned with this disclosure strategy that I was mentioning before. What are the principles that I would recommend to consider when selecting the right metrics? Well, material to the business. They should be relevant. They should be aligned with this contribution to the long-term value creation and to this the climate strategy. They should be material to the individual. I often say that whenever you say someone they have to make a huge effort for 10% of their salary, maybe they don't do a great effort for 10% of their salary. So it has to be material. Whatever is your materiality test, it's to be debated, but for sure everybody could agree that a minimum of 5 or 10% is probably a minimum, right? Try to find KPIs that are measurable reliably in a quantifiable manner rather than subjective or qualitative way, and that can be scaled down, because we are talking about top management. They will want to be able to cascade down these metrics. They should also have be broad enough as to encompass all what you can do according to what we said before. These elements that poses a risk or that are poses an opportunity for you. It might not be only carbon emission, it might be something else. Just think about your processes, and if you are building if you have a long-term incentive, which is kind of talking about a milestone of opening a new plant in a new country, maybe what you have to say is, and if the new plant is reducing carbon emissions by X in respect of the other plants we already have in operation, maybe it is that what you have to do, right? Comparability, not easy again, but hopefully if you use standards in the industry to help stakeholders to compare how you do, that's very valuable, because it may not be that important for you as an organization, but this is a complex matter for everybody. So the easier we make it for our stakeholders to assess how well we are doing through a comparability type of exercise, we are selling ourselves better. So that's a nice to have as well. Of course, obvious things, the clear, transparent, and consistent. metrics are important. What other things we should be, we were talking before in item 4, what type of LTI, what type of vehicle, what type of lever can we use? So there is a range we can use. This is somehow ordered by the impact that they have in a company, and the confidence that the company may have in each type of, in the overall climate measurement, how confident they feel about their ability to do it right. So the simplest, easier thing is the underpin. The underpin just simply say, hey, this is what you have to do. By the way, if you achieve this, you are going to be, passing the test. But this is going to be a very basic test. It's like, yeah, we have to score good in our sustainability index, whatever it is, the index you may be participating. This can be an STI, LTI. So it's the very basic. It's an easy challenge. Companies have already, the majority of companies that I see have already moved away from that. They have already gone through this phase and are already including it either as an individual performance modifier or a company performance modifier, which is essentially, it either affects an individual. If it is the CEO, yeah, of course, it is individual, but it affects the whole company probably. Or if maybe a company performance-wise, because it affects many people. And, but again, it's just, hey, whatever your bonus is, from 90 to 110% of that is going to be adjusted by this climate-related modifier. So again, the impact is limited. Again, we are not 100% confident that we can do it very well or not. The next step in, sophistication is, no, we take a portion of the short term. We say 20% of your short term depends on carbon emission reduction, or the new plan to be greener. That's already major words. It's a part of the pie. And of course, the greater the part, the more relevant it is. This is connection with that. And of course, if you put it in long-term incentive, it means you feel more confident than if you put it in short-term. And what I've seen also is companies that say, well, I may put something in the long term that is more connected to the strategy, and I put something in the short term that is more connected to the tactics, the implementation of this strategy, the milestones for achieving the goals in the long term. That's a trend I'm seeing as well. An alternative mechanism of including whether, instead of company performance modifier or, weighted metric, you can put it in the funding formula. You all probably have here about bonus pools. So this is essentially an element, whether it's through a modifier or through a weight in the funding formula, that will affect everybody. But it's essentially the same mechanism at a different level. And finally, the more sophisticated things, and to be honest, I haven't seen many companies getting there just yet, is you have a separate standalone incentive plan. So, you simply have another LTI, for instance, which is just focusing on that. Now, someone asked me one, why would I do that? And say, because the horizon for this sustainability journey is just not 3 years. Your long-term incentives is likely going to be 3 years or 4 years, but your strategy for this might not be that. So once you feel confident that you can communicate and manage that, you may say, hey, I have a long-term 10 years incentive plan, which is about that. And of course, in the meantime, I may have all of the other things. Now, big words, but that's probably something that makes sense in the very long-term mindset of companies. The final thing that I perhaps wanted to show is a couple of examples. I'm not going to stop here. You will have access to the information. So just a way to implement that, you'll see they, in LTI, 25% weight. So these companies are already advanced. They are doing it advanced. They graded it, they calibrated, so they feel confident about all of that. I will leave it for there, or if there is a question, just feel free to ask, because I want to finish, in conscious of time, I want to finish with a couple of conclusion ideas. Not going to focus on the do's, because that can be distilled from the conversation and the slides, but what the don'ts. I just want to stress the don'ts. So the check the box exercise, which has been common, is no longer valid. Don't follow blindly market practice, make it yours. Don't don't set goals that has no meaning at the end of the day, that are judgment-based or ambiguous, and managing annual reports and executive compensation and everything that has to do with climate transition or ESG in general in silos will not work either. So I will highlight those. So running out of time, sorry to be quick, but let me just open up and hand over to Shai Ganu. Shai, I hope you introduce yourself and introduce Michael and Natasha. But for the time being, thank you everybody for listening to me.
Thank you, Manuel. And again, good afternoon, everybody. And we understand that there are people dialing in from different parts of the world. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Shai Ganu. As my friends know that I'm not really shy. I lead Willis Towers Watson's executive compensation and board advisory practice globally. For WTW, that's about 600 consultants in 40 different markets who advise clients on compensation committee, nominations and governance committee, and ESG and sustainability committee issues. Manuel, thank you for walking us through this guidebook. And then I'm sure we could have spent another hour just talking about the guidebook, but it is my distinct pleasure to invite two of our very distinguished panelists to give us more insights on this topic, and particularly giving a practical view on how to manage some of the theoretical aspects along with what goes along in the boardroom. So maybe just quickly introducing them. We are incredibly fortunate to have a very strong panel. First, we have Natasha Martsekis. Natasha is a board member at Hellenic Petroleum Group of Companies. She's a non-executive board member at Forlis Trade Estates and a Secretary General of Ned Club Greece, and also a member of the ESG working group at ecoDa. So welcome, Natasha.
Good afternoon, good morning to Europe. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Excellent. And we also have Michael Hilb. So Michael is the chair of the International Board Foundation and co-chair of Chapter 0 Switzerland. He is a board member of both listed and unlisted companies, and also lectures on corporate governance at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. So welcome, Michael.
Good afternoon.
Excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can imagine, a topic of this magnitude, we could have spent hours talking about, but we want to try to distill this discussion in the next 35 minutes. So maybe we'll get started with a very broad question to Natasha. But as we're doing that, if anybody from the participants or the audience has questions, please feel free to type that in the chat, and I'll try to weave those questions during the conversation. But Natasha, maybe just starting with the why of doing this, and specifically thinking about investors. Now, given your background, would love to hear your perspectives of how have investors' expectations around linking climate strategies with remuneration evolved? How have your interactions with compensation committees and boards changed in this regard over the last couple of years?
Yes, thank you, Shai. A very interesting question indeed. I think that what we are seeing nowadays is a very, very strong consensus among investors that climate metrics selected by companies should be transparent, first of all, measurable, and when linked to compensation for the executives. However, there is a recent Deloitte review of proxy statements, those filed between February of 2020 and January 2021, that show only 40% of the Fortune 100 companies in the US have incorporated ESG measure in the executive plans. But I think more than ever, investors nowadays expect companies to demonstrate, first of all, the suitability, the appropriateness, and also the extent of these metrics by disclosing them very clearly in the market. I also see a very interesting trend, which comes from investors, that they take no risk not to give credit to companies just for the sake of greenwashing. So they're very, very skeptical when this appropriate market-leading disclosure is lacking. One other trend which I think that investors expect to see, as very correctly Manuel pointed out, they want also to see evidence of linking these metrics to significant commercial milestones and industrial milestones, as these milestones are contained in the company strategies. So, for example, This could be a percentage of your energy coming from renewable resources, or shifting your procedures from carbon intensive to a low carbon or carbon-free alternatives. I think more specifically about the greenhouse gas targets, which is also, they relate so much to climate. I think investors are not looking for them to be a percentage reduction over the prior years, but they would like to see companies aligning their roadmap versus the Paris Agreement. A few more points before I finish. We see a lot of these ESG metrics to be already in use by some companies, but I think what investors are also looking for is that companies look at these metrics from a new ESG lens, and they clearly align them and make them really deliverable. But not also deliverable, but also they communicate them very, very clearly with the investment community. And also they want to see these metrics rewarding executives for improving efficiency and the quality of the sustainability management system, and that they are forward-looking. And your final point regarding the board, I think the boards, we are all empowered by our shareholders to oversee the ESG strategy. However, I think that investors are looking very, very closely to nominating and governance committees, that they have an oversight role in all of this. And they want to ensure that the compensation, the processes, and the implementation of the executive compensation programs are very, very closely linked to the sustainability objectives of each company.
Fantastic. Thank you, Natasha. Clearly, a lot what you just shared, and I suspect we'll come back to some of these themes later on.
Definitely.
But I think one of your points was very well noted, that it's also a question of materiality. So at WTW, we engage a lot with institutional investors because when we are advising clients on executive compensation and ESG measures, we also want to understand how institutional investors are viewing this. And one of these institutional investors said something that has really stuck with me, saying that when they're voting on the remuneration items, they're not just looking at remuneration disclosures, they're also looking at the company's CapEx investments to see how real is the decarbonization effect versus just being greenwashing. And I think that was really good counsel, that don't just think about remuneration only in the remuneration context, think of it in the broader, what are you doing to actually achieve those goals? So it's broader than lip service. So thank you, that is really good insight.
Exactly, thank you.
Michael, turning to you, and maybe just a similarly broad question to begin with before we get into some details. So in your view, how important is it to align climate goals with executive incentive plans? And do you see any difference between publicly listed versus private companies?
Yes, no, thanks for the question. I think I fully agree with Natasha and Manuel said before. I think there are a lot of mounting expectations towards support to integrate those topics. I think a lot of external pressure and our expectation of put it more positively. But what I believe, what as important as is meeting the external expectations to align your compensation climate schemes with your compensation philosophy, incentive philosophy. There's some companies who believe you need to incentivize, for every action the CEO does or the executive team does. Others have a very different philosophy. And in my view, it's very important you treat climate, change or the climate transition as you would do other topics, based on the same philosophy. At the same time, however, I would see, definitely some differences of climate-related topics as compared to any other, kind of priorities you want to incentivize. And I think Manuel mentioned very clearly before, I think it's this long-term implication, I think, which is a challenge. And secondly, and let's face reality, I think, there are no standard metrics around yet, and it will take quite some time to get there. And then the third one as well, we should not, live up to any illusion. I think there will be trade-offs. There are trade-offs, they're not just win-win situations of this transition, but there will be trade-offs. So I think these are, three components which I believe are quite important to face and to realize. Now, to your second question about private and listed companies, I think a very interesting question, because what I observe that yes, there might be different approaches those companies take when they deal with this topic. Quite obviously, listed companies might be very much driven by external expectations. That's it's quite obvious. And what I see that many privately owned companies, they might take a bit more time to really discuss the why. So what do we want to achieve? What's the purpose? And how does it fit with our overall kind of philosophy and strategy? I think that's where I see, I think, different levels or different types of conversations in boards.
Indeed. And again, you've touched on a theme that is very important when it comes to executive compensation. It's finding that balance and finding those trade-offs, right? As a lot of boards actually spend a good amount of time actually finding those right balance between trade-offs. Because inherently, the good thing about incentives is that they drive behavior. The bad thing about incentives is that they drive behavior. So we want to encourage the right behaviors and discourage the wrong ones. So thank you, Michael. That's really good counsel. Natasha, coming back to you, and across your various boards, how have the industry or geographic differences been reflected in the way each compensation committee approaches linking climate change or broader ESG measures with executive pay? So are you seeing any differences from industry or geographic perspectives?
Yes, I thank you for the question. As Manuel, I think, very quickly mentioned, in 2019, the World Economic Forum unveiled really the principles for the effective climate governance for non-executive members on the boards. And there, out of the 8 principles, principle 6, as many of our attendees might remember, they're talking about incentivization of boards. And practically they're alluding to the right behavior of boards and the right mechanisms into climate transition strategy. Definitely, I think that there is no one size fits all approach when it comes for talking about the executive compensation. And I think companies are looking to identify and reflect the specific nature of their business when doing so. So we see differences across sectors, across geographies, and obviously business models. I think that climate risk affects different companies in different ways. Heavy emitters, obviously, companies that either produce or consume large amount of fossil fuels, they face the challenge of reshaping their business models. We have companies that they have physical assets in areas that they are prone to extreme weather events. And these companies, they must identify strategies to mitigate these risks. And this has to be embedded into their executive compensation. Definitely, we've seen that certain industries, we expect to find a higher percentage of ESG measures due to the nature of the business. For example, within the FTSE 100, obviously oil, gas, mineral, chemical, pharmaceuticals, they have the highest range and the highest metrics in ESG measures, and also in their bonuses and in their long-term incentivization plans. However, we see retail, distribution, software, logistic companies, they have a lower percentage. I will give a very quick example which describes the range a little bit. For example, BP uses ESG measures on its annual bonus. Starting in 2020, the bonus had, I think, 15% weighting. The long-term plan now has a 40% weighting around strategic goals where you have input measures around renewables, energy transition. But it's not only the oil-related companies. A very interesting example to my mind is Apple, which has introduced a modifier to executive bonus plans, adjusting them to their 10 principles. And it's very interesting because these principles refer to accessibility, to environment, to education, to diversity, to privacy, and supplier accountability. So you really see practically that this is a different example. And a final example comes, I think, from BT that shows the differences across sectors. British Telecom, the telecoms company in the UK, they operate a restricted share plan, which practically has an important underpin, as Manuel made an example before, that there should be no ESG related issues in material reputational damage. So I think this is a very interesting example of how different companies address the issue.
That is very, very insightful, Natasha. Thank you. And not just different companies, but also clearly different time horizons, because I recall in Apple's case in particular, and this is all public domain, Apple for the longest time actually resisted proposals from shareholders to explicitly link incentives to ESG measures, because the board's view was they are doing the right thing anyways. They don't need to make that connection. But clearly, investor pressure and other priorities shifted over time. So now they have this modifier. So thank you. That's a really good example. Appreciate that. Michael, and again, sort of coming back to you on this. We've spoken a little bit about ESG goals and climate goals. But in your experience, what specific challenges do companies experience in relation to climate metric selection and target setting? And in particular, how critical is it to have performance against targets that are appropriately and externally validated?
Mm-hmm. I think you really hit the heart of the challenge in my view, when you talk about those topics. So I always, try to summarize or, see it. I always see 4 challenges in this topic. It's the 4 M challenges: the mission, it's the metrics, measuring, and the measure challenge. And I think to me, they're very much related to each other. I think the easiest one is always the mission challenge. So as a company, are you able to really identify what is the right approach? And I think Natasha very nicely kind of showed the whole range of stance you can take. So do you want to be a leader? You want to be a laggard? I think, and then all of this can make sense if it's really, and that's nested in the strategy and in the relevance, materiality of the topic. And to me, I think that's the first one, to be very clear on the board level, to have this kind of debate and discussion. But I think that's the easiest one. I think then, you get to your point, the metrics. Yes, and here, as I said before, I think there's no, commonly accepted metrics yet. There's a lot of very, sound work being done coming from science, which I think we need to take into account. But here again, I think very important to choose those which very, fit to your company, which really kind of reflects your operations as well. So it's very close to what you're doing, and you choose kind of these kind of metrics. And then you might need to do some explaining. I think, as was mentioned before, Manuel, you have to tell the story, be able to explain to all the stakeholders why you choose this particular one, but really try to be very, very precise in that. And then I think the measuring, I think that gets even more complicated, as Natasha said before. That's then you fall into risk of greenwashing and all of that. So here again, it's my observation. Try to be a little bit modest in what kind of metrics you choose, and also realistic what kind of measuring you really aspire to, and then really focus on the 4th one, on the measures, on the action as such. I think that you can do. You can do without being, limitations. That's your responsibility, accountability, and it might be that you only will be able to really measure the impact later on, but that's totally fine, because you have done the right thing, you have moved in the right direction, and then later on you will be able to also communicate this progress, to all the stakeholders.
Brilliant, Michael. Thank you. Do you mind just repeating the 4 M's that you mentioned? Because I'm sure it'll resonate with a lot of people. So there was mission,
I think the first one is
metrics.
the mission, be clear on the mission. The second one, be clear on the metrics. So what are the KPIs you want to measure? The third one, it's the measures as such, the actions. So what actually are you doing to get there? And then the 4th one is the measuring. So how are you going to measure whether you achieve the objectives?
Excellent. I think I suspect a lot of people have taken notes on that, because that's good way of framing the thought process. Thank you, Michael. Natasha, just coming back to you, and again, we touched upon, I guess, the role of different constituents in this debate, but specifically in Europe, institutional investors and proxy advisors play a big role when it comes to executive pay. So I guess my question is, what role do you see these stakeholders, so particularly the institutional investors or proxy advisory services, playing in driving the change around executive pay and ESG and climate measures, given their influence on voting outcomes in Europe? So would be keen to hear your perspectives on this topic.
Yes, thank you, Shai. A very interesting topic indeed, and actually with a lot of publicity recently. I think that most institutional investors nowadays start to consider incentive plans as a really powerful tool in accelerating this transition in the companies that they invest in. I think they understand that by elevating the issue to the boardroom and by holding the executives accountable, they are pushing to see for this disclosure of meaningful climate-related targets and how these are incorporated in the plans. I think 2 very interesting examples, which have been also very public. Allianz, which is one of the of Europe's largest asset managers. I think they manage around 700 billion euros, and they hold around 10,000 European and US companies, together with an activist investor called Sevian Capital, have been very, very vocal about urging companies and other, investors and urge them to join them against voting against for companies that they fail to link executive pay and climate targets. So I think it's going to be an interesting season ahead of us in terms of AGMs. I think that many investors would be tempted to use their vote at their annual meetings to call out on groups and companies that they don't include these metrics in compensation. I think that the gist here is that investors are using their power, and they're hoping to really address the disconnect between emission targets, which have typically long deadlines, and also the shortening tenure of the boards, which is something that Manuel explained before. So we see really climate targets of with 15-year duration, but then investors ask, how are we going to judge these boards when their tenure is over in 5 years? So we see really a tendency to connect this link. One more thing to mention here, in November, the shareholder advisory group, Institutional Shareholder Services, they released a consultation for as a guideline in Europe and the UK, and they proposed evaluating non-ESG metrics in pay plans in a similar way that you evaluate financial ones. So this is another thing that will be a tendency, I believe, in the upcoming annual meetings. Finally, one point to make here is a danger that investors see in smaller companies where they invest, where climate change is less of a significant issue on the agenda. There is a risk that less rigorous programs of executive compensation might be applied, and that would be easier to hit. So this is a space to watch, I think, especially for those smaller companies that they are looking to introduce incentive plans linked to climate.
Again, points very well made, Natasha. Thank you for that. And clearly, some of these institutional investors, like the ones that you mentioned, Sevian was actually part of one of our panels when we were launching the guidebook with WEF and Chapter 0 and Climate Governance Initiative. And so clearly, the views of institutional investors and the code red for humanity and the urgency is coming across very strongly. Maybe I'll just break things up a little bit and turn to some of the questions from the chat. So either of you feel free to answer this, but there was linked to, I think, Natasha, what you were describing just now. There was a question in the chat which is in which kind of companies do you see the link between climate performance measures and executive compensation? Do you see it mainly happening in big listed companies? And I guess what you were talking about, big versus small companies, I think that could be an interesting discussion point right now. Anybody who wants to answer, Michael or perhaps both of you may have.
Yeah, both of us.
Please go ahead, Natasha.
Okay, I think there's definitely a tendency here to see bigger companies for several reasons. The first reason is that obviously they are pushed and by their shareholders to do so. As I mentioned before, the smaller companies, they have perhaps less aggressive targets in terms of climate risk in the compensation plan. So they don't feel the urgency to do so in such a pronounced way that we see the big companies. And again, the sector, I think, here plays a very, very big role. So it's evident that, the heavy emitters, as I mentioned before, they feel that they have to go down that path of linking the compensation.
Fair enough. Michael?
Yeah, I think that's definitely, I would subscribe to that as well. I think also see another interesting trend. You see sometimes younger companies, small companies might not be listed yet, which actually look at climate transition as an entrepreneurial opportunity, which they really see we can actually create new business models. We can, do a lot of innovation in that area. And there I see a very different driver, of actually embracing climate transition, which then as well, they do it then very comprehensively, not just launching new products, but as well, including in compensation. So I think at these peak drivers, definitely the big listed companies, which a little bit, face the expectations from the markets, from regulators. Yeah. And then I see a lot of younger, innovative companies, which do it, probably for a slightly different motivation.
No, I fully agree. And if I may just also share my 2 cents on this, I think this debate about big versus small companies is an important one. But in the grand scheme of things, actually all companies are going to have to get behind this. I know the larger companies get a lot more public and media scrutiny, but it's actually the smaller companies who tend to do more innovative things. And particularly the private companies, the smaller companies, in some of these cases, it's almost an existential question that if they do not focus on climate transition, then their financial viability is at risk, particularly for the smaller companies. So it becomes that much more urgent for them. But thank you both for your insights on this. Michael, maybe just coming back to you then, and specifically looking at the role of the board. So how do you ensure that the board is equipped to provide oversight and ensure that management has the necessary strategies, goals, skills, capabilities to address climate change and incentives?
I think it's a very good question, because again, what you want to avoid, what Manuel said before, you want to avoid it to make it a checkbox exercise. Again, that's for sure. And I think to me, it really takes what you just mentioned before, this very integrated perspective. So you look at governance, strategy, metrics, all together. It's even something which even the regulators, is asking increasingly, that they not just ask you to report, but actually showcase that you have integrated into the strategy, you have the governance systems, you have the people and all that. So I think it will become a must and not just a nice to have for many boards. So how to get there? I think, on the one hand, it's about, the composition of the board. You have the right people. And I'm not saying you don't need to replace people and bring in now all kind of sustainability experts, but I think make sure people get exposed to topics, join discussions like today, read your kind of guide and get in a debate, do best practice sharing. I think that's to me very important, to have the openness. Secondly, and I think that's another very important point, my experience has been have a very open collaboration, within the board, but as well with the board, with external stakeholders, and with experts within your organization, because you need proper people from operations who really can explain to you, how to measure it, what it takes, what's the implication of any actions you define. So it becomes very technically, very quickly. So make sure you tap into this internal knowledge you have in the corporation. And then finally, I would say you need the right culture. That's obvious, but I think very important here as well, to have this openness, kind of challenge each other, really ask yourselves, why are we doing it? What's our motivation behind it? And are we really up to speed, or do we need to bring in some external expertise to help us on this journey?
No, great point. And sorry, again, given the hat that you wear as co-chair of Chapter Zero Switzerland, just a small plug for this organization, Chapter Zero and Climate Governance Initiative. They're doing some phenomenal work, and they've been exemplary partners for us, and I know for ecoDa as well. And one of the things that the CGI's mandate is to uplift the capabilities at a board level, because the premise is when directors and board members are putting emphasis on this issue, then management gets in line. And we've always taken a view that the role of the board, or the intent should be that the board at least should be climate literate, if not climate experts. Ideally, you want them to be climate experts, but if not, they should be at least climate literate, so they know what the right questions are to ask, which is very aligned with what you are sharing there, Michael. So I appreciate that. Thank you. So Natasha, so just shifting gears slightly, and if we think about to what extent do you think is there consensus among investors and the broader community about how climate should be incorporated in executive pay? If companies are not making meaningful progress on their climate transitions, then what are the actions do you think investors are likely to take?
Yes, thank you, Shai. This is an interesting follow-up question on the expectations, I think, of investors. And definitely, a very large number of the institutional investor community, they have expressed an interest that ESG measures are related to executive pay. However, there's a big range. I mean, opinions range from a general commentary on the importance of considering the ESG as an important measure for executive pay and performance. And there's the other spectrum where we have very specific recommendations coming from shareholders, institutional investors, or activist groups about the extent and the exact implementation of these measures. So as we said before, Sevian and Amundi, they were very vocal about these measures to be linked directly to shareholder value and sustainable growth. For example, Legal and General Investment Management, they have advised that ESG risk should be incorporated as a relevant and important risk in the executive remuneration. And they have been quite vocal about the ESG weighting should be no more than 1/3 of the total compensation plan. So following up on this, I think that many institutional investors this year will monitor also the adjustments that companies make to the compensation mix and also the targets, and will be skeptical about when these adjustments are not aligned with shareholder returns. And I think that companies in the upcoming AGMs will be asked to disclose the rationale behind these adjustments. Looking at the policy updates for the 2022 proxy season, I think these updates, they reflect a continuing trend from shareholder advisory firms, from institutional investors, from all stakeholders. All of these groups, they have very high expectations that boards will take a very proactive role in overseeing the management of the sustainability risks, and including these risks and disclosing to shareholders. We see some proxy advisors that they don't maintain a very specific policy about companies including these metrics. However, when a company includes the metrics, they have to provide a very robust disclosure and determination of the payout opportunities. I think that this is something that we will continue to see. And also we will expect from investors to pay a lot of attention to remuneration committees and consider the management of these matters as of primary importance. Also, we expect remuneration committees and governance committees to put a very strong emphasis in recruitment policies that they really attract the real talent for the companies in order to guide them to this kind of climate transition.
I think that is a very important point, both the recruitment at management level, but also at the board level, because it needs to start there with alignment of values. So thank you, Natasha. And again, very meaningful insights there. Just switching a little bit to the questions in the chat, but first I did want to acknowledge a comment that Frederick made to the earlier discussion about large companies versus small companies. And I think Frederick makes a really good point that particularly private or small companies who are in the supply chain, they need to embark on the transition far quicker because their bigger customers or their bigger suppliers would expect it of them. So if you're a Nestle or a Unilever, and if you say that anybody in the supply chain needs to decarbonize, then that's actually going to put pressure on everybody in the supply chain. So thank you for that, Frederick. But it also leads to another question, which we had in the Q&A, on Scope 3 emissions, one of the favorite topics to talk about when you're talking about climate change. So the question is, there is significant demand on integrating Scope 3 emissions into climate policies. Could we discuss the best way to try to integrate Scope 3 in executive compensation? So do either of you have any experience that you want to share on this?
I think it's, it just indicates, I think, kind of the scope of this question, which is it's a difficult question, a challenge we all face. And I think the question for me is how we can overcome the challenge. And to me, it's, I think, really what I said before, to realize the limitations we have at the moment, with lack of clear standards. with still an ongoing debate on how to do it, on what to measure. And we should just be very open and accept the realities. But I think there are ways to overcome it. I think to me, it's a dialogue, a debate. So I think really make it inclusive, include, all the key stakeholders which have a say, we have experience, we have a stake, and try to define those metrics in a collaborative effort. I think that's to me one solution, because again, whatever you would provide, somebody won't find it sufficient, or will find it going too far. I think you need to have the right process in place to get to results, which then I think gets you closer to what you want to achieve.
Fair enough. Thank you, Michael. Any other insight, Natasha?
Yes, I think that regarding the Scope 3 emissions, which we have been asked about, a lot of that I think falls into the governance policies, and also these governance policies, they have to go down and trickle down to some of the operating policies of the companies. For example, when you purchase goods, when you look at buying capital goods, even your employee commuting is a Scope 3 emissions. So I think this goes back to the whole culture that I mentioned before, and also has to do with educating your organization about how to be working in a sustainable environment. So it's I agree with Michael. It's not easy. It's very challenging. It has a very big field of application, and this is something that companies would be challenged to tackle, I think.
Absolutely. And this one in particular, I think the answer also has a very strong industry focus to it, because there are some industries where the supply chain, the Scope 3 are more defined, so it's easier for you to get your arms around, and others might be a little bit more fragmented. But just to give you an example, one of the leading supermarkets in the UK, they've publicly announced Scope 3 emissions and reduction of Scope 3 emissions, and how they're planning to do that is by influencing the consumer's average grocery basket by changing consumers' buying patterns towards more green-friendly products, right? And again, that is the power that large organizations have. If you can change the consumer buying patterns, that they're more environmentally friendly products, and you can start measuring that in your Scope 3 emissions, I mean, the incentives is a nice small piece to it, but the bigger impact to society is, of course, the bigger prize here. But thank you both for your insights. I'm very conscious of time, so maybe one last question to Michael, and then we'll wrap up. So Michael, for those of us who might be at the beginning of this journey, how can we secure the board's support in ensuring an integrated approach to compensation that covers both climate and then, of course, broader ESG measures?
Yeah, I think first of all, I would say it's never too late to start. I think that's number one. I think it will be a very long journey, so but get started. Secondly, I would say, to me, it's like a marathon. In the marathon, on the one hand, yeah, it's a long-term approach, so you need to have patience, discipline, get it done. Secondly, in a marathon, you have also to be able to change the pace from time to time. So some time you need to accelerate, you need to focus, put an emphasis on. Other times you need to consolidate what you have achieved. And then number three, I think to be successful at the marathon, you have to practice, you have to train a lot. And I would just invite everybody, get into your practice, join session like this, read guides, share, your insights with your colleagues, and get the mindset, get into the mindset. I think that's, to me, would be the foremost recommendation. Talk about it in the board, talk about it with your colleagues, and then try it out. Try it out. It might not be the perfect solution you are, but you're getting into practice.
Brilliant. I think this is a really good way of ending today's session. So I know, Natasha, you had a hard stop, so please feel free to excuse yourself. We're just going to wrap up now. But ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking both Michael and Natasha for the great insights. I'm sure we could have continued talking about this for the next hour or so, but unfortunately time has run out. Before we end, I did want to just summarize a couple of things. And first of all, again, a big thank you to the panelists for wonderful conversations and really practical insights. I also wanted to take this opportunity to thank Beatrice and Manon from ecoDa. They've done a tremendous amount of work behind the scenes in helping pull all this together. And thank you both for furthering this important conversation. And before we end the session, I just wanted to sort of use a quote. And this is a quote by, it's a very poignant quote by Chief Seattle, the Native American leader in whose honor the wonderful city of Seattle gets its name. And the quote is, "Humankind has not woven the web of life. We are all but one thread within it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. All things are bound together, all things connect." And this connection between all things serves as a very important inspiration and motivation for this guidebook and the work that we do. There is a lot to be done for the business community to learn about the implications of transition to net zero. And of course, setting consistent and reliable goals and milestones will be challenging. But as the panelists mentioned, let perfect not be the enemy of good. So get started on this journey and iterate on that, learn from it, and then build on that knowledge base. And ladies and gentlemen, if you take nothing out of today's session, then my final request to you would be, we have seen companies who have done this successfully and companies who have not done this successfully. Companies who have done this successfully, they are not doing this out of the goodness of their hearts. And I think this is a key point, a key message I'd like the audience to take. The moral imperative, the tree-hugging moral imperative only gets you so far. What makes this a real meaningful change is when companies begin to appreciate the tangible financial and non-financial benefits that come out of this. Higher valuations, lower cost of capital, customer stickiness, employee engagement, tangible financial and non-financial benefits of aligning your ESG priorities with your incentive plans. So hopefully this conversation was helpful and furthered people's thinking a bit on this. But with that, thank you all for joining. Hope you found this session useful. And with that, we'll end today's session. Good day and have a good weekend.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.